Maya had worked at the city zoo for nearly 6 years, moving between enclosures, cleaning habitats, preparing diets, and monitoring behavior. She had always been calm and capable, comfortable around the animals, and trusted by the staff. That afternoon, the sky was beginning to dim, casting long shadows across the walkways as she made her final rounds. Most visitors had already left, and the zoo had grown quiet, except for the occasional cry from the bird aviary or the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Her last stop was the brown bear enclosure, a large reinforced habitat bordered by high fencing, concrete barriers, and a deep trench meant to keep animals and humans apart safely. The bear, a fully grown male named Brutus, had been pacing more than usual in recent weeks. He weighed nearly 800 pounds and was known for his strength and unpredictability. Maya approached the outer ledge where staff often tossed food from above. She leaned over slightly, holding a bucket of raw meat and produce. The gate to the lower feeding area was supposed to be locked and checked twice daily, but no one had seen the hairline fracture in the barrier near the feeding chute, damage likely caused by age, stress, or weather, and missed during a recent structural inspection. As Maya reached out to tip the bucket, a sudden movement caught her eye. Then came the impact. In less than a second, Brutus surged through the small opening, too narrow for a full escape but wide enough for his powerful forelimb to reach through. His massive paw clamped around her forearm with a terrifying grip, claws digging into her sleeve, then flesh. She didn't even have time to cry out before she was yanked forward, her ribs slamming against the edge of the wall, the force jarring her bones and knocking the air from her lungs. Panic erupted inside her. She screamed as loud as her body would allow, her free hand beating wildly against the bear's snout while her legs scrambled for leverage. Brutus growled deeply, jerking her back and forth with alarming ease, his claws slicing into her jacket and arm, his teeth snapping inches from her face. Her shoulder twisted violently as she was dragged halfway over the barrier, her lower body dangling in the air. She kicked unthinkingly, feeling the strain in her joints, the burn of torn muscle, and the sickening crunch of bones under pressure. Blood ran down her elbow, dripping onto the concrete below, as the bear kept pulling, muscles rippling with every movement. Maya fought to stay upright, slamming her knee into the wall for stability, but it only angered Brutus more. The pain grew worse, radiating through her chest and neck. She thought her arm would come off. She thought she might be pulled into the enclosure altogether. The world narrowed to the sound of snarls, the blur of claws, and the raw terror in her chest. Somewhere nearby, Jake, another keeper finishing his duties, heard the scream. It was sharp and desperate, so different from anything he'd heard from Maya. He dropped what he was doing and sprinted across the service path toward the enclosure. As he approached the platform, he saw the nightmare unfolding. Maya's body hanging partway over the barrier, the bear jerking her arm like it was a rag doll. For a second, he froze, trying to make sense of it. Then instinct took over. He rushed toward the emergency gate where the staff kept response gear and grabbed the industrial water hose mounted on the wall. He twisted the valve and aimed the thick nozzle at the bear. A powerful blast of cold water hit Brutus in the side of the head, forcing him to pause. The bear snarled, pulling back slightly. Jake shifted his stance and kept the water aimed at the animal's eyes and snout, the spray loud and violent, echoing off the concrete walls. The bear gave a final tug on Maya's arm before suddenly releasing her, letting her fall limply back against the platform. Jake shouted for her to crawl, and she moved, dragging herself slowly away, her face pale and smeared with dirt and blood. She didn't look back. She didn't speak. She kept crawling, her body trembling as the hose hammered the bear, forcing it to retreat into its den. Jake shut the water off and knelt beside her, quickly calling for help on his radio. Within minutes, more staff arrived and secured the area, ushering Maya onto a stretcher and rushing her toward the on-site medical unit before transferring her to a city hospital. Her injuries were extensive: bruises across her ribs and collarbone, torn ligaments in her shoulder, deep gashes on her forearm and wrist, and multiple fractures in her hand and elbow. She spent over a week in the hospital and underwent 2 surgeries to stabilize the damage. Although the bones healed with time, she lost feeling in 3 fingers and would never regain full strength in her grip. An internal investigation revealed that the enclosure's lower barrier had a compromised section. An old weld had cracked, likely months earlier, hidden beneath a layer of paint and rust. The last inspection missed it, and no one had noticed the subtle shift in the bear's pacing pattern or his increasing attention to the weak spot. It was a structural failure, not a human mistake, but it changed how the zoo handled its animal safety checks going forward. Maya eventually returned to work in an administrative role and was no longer responsible for daily animal care. She stayed close to the zoo community but avoided the carnivore enclosures altogether. Jake was quietly recognized for his quick thinking and later promoted. As for Brutus, he remained in the zoo, heavily monitored, with reinforced barriers added and stricter protocols implemented. People sometimes asked Maya why she stayed. She would only say she loved the animals, even the dangerous ones. But she never forgot that afternoon. The sudden violence, the helplessness, the sound of teeth just inches from her throat, and how close she came to never walking away. Piatra Neamt, Romania, October 12, 2018. The Carpathian Mountains, stretching across Eastern Europe like an ancient spine, have long been a source of mineral wealth. For centuries, these rugged peaks were mined for salt, silver, and gold, leaving behind a vast hidden network of tunnels, shafts, and chambers beneath the forest floor. Near the scenic Romanian town of Piatra Neamt, many of these subterranean structures remain buried under layers of moss and silence, relics of long-forgotten industry. Among those captivated by these spaces was Dr. Matei Antonescu, a seasoned speleologist working with a leading geological research institute. Over a 15-year career, Antonescu had earned respect for his meticulous cave surveys and ecological fieldwork across the Eastern Carpathians. At 47, he remained deeply dedicated to exploring remote environments, often alone. In the fall of 2018, his attention turned to a rarely documented 19th-century silver mine carved during the Austro-Hungarian period. Located in a remote sector of the mountains, the site had seen little human presence in decades. Antonescu hoped to map its internal layout and assess its potential for future ecological research before winter snows made access impossible. That October brought an earlier-than-expected seasonal shift. Cold air swept down from the peaks, and wildlife had already begun retreating into dens. On the morning of the 12th, under overcast skies, Antonescu left his temporary field camp and set off toward the site. His assistant had returned to the capital 2 days prior for personal reasons, but rather than postpone the trip, Antonescu pressed on alone, something he had done many times before. With basic survival gear and layered clothing, he navigated a forest trail until reaching the mine entrance. Hidden by fallen branches and thick undergrowth, the entrance required minor clearing. Once inside, the air was cool and damp, filled with the sharp scent of stone. But something else lingered, a musty animal scent that made him pause. Still, he continued forward. Activating his headlamp, Antonescu documented his surroundings as he advanced into the mine. The main tunnel sloped gently downward, its timber supports surprisingly intact. After about 40 meters, the passage split into 3 smaller corridors. Following procedure, he marked his position and selected the center tunnel for initial exploration. As he progressed, the space narrowed. Soon he was crawling through a constricted shaft, the sounds of his movement, boots scraping, gear brushing rock, amplified by the close walls. Unknown to him, these noises were disturbing something further below. The warning came suddenly. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the tunnel. Antonescu froze, then slowly raised his headlamp. About 10 meters ahead, just past where the tunnel widened again, 2 amber-colored eyes reflected in his beam, eyes fixed on him from a massive shape in the darkness. A Carpathian brown bear, a large, solitary male estimated later to weigh nearly 300 kilograms, had taken refuge in the mine. It had likely selected the shaft as an early denning site, retreating from the approaching cold and encroaching human activity in the surrounding forest. Feeling cornered and defensive, the bear charged. Antonescu scrambled backward, slipping on the slick floor. One of the animal's swipes tore through his clothing and left a deep injury to his left shoulder, slamming him into the rock wall. Despite the pain, he remained conscious. In the confusion, he spotted a narrow crevice formed by a collapsed beam and wedged himself tightly into the gap, just wide enough to keep the bear from reaching him directly. For 6 hours, he remained there, wounded, silent, and motionless. The bear did not immediately leave. It paced nearby, growling intermittently and occasionally swiping at the rock barrier. The confined space amplified every sound. Blood from his injury soaked into his clothing, and the cold air inside the mine began draining his strength. His phone, tucked in his pack, was unusable. The rock above blocked any signal. As dusk approached and the forest outside began to darken, the bear eventually withdrew deeper into the mine. Still, Antonescu waited another hour before daring to move. Slowly and with great effort, he crawled out of the narrow space and began retracing his steps through the tunnel. Every movement deliberate, every sound weighed against the possibility of triggering another response. By the time he reached the forest outside, night had nearly fallen. Exhausted, cold, and in pain, he made his way to his vehicle and drove to the nearest settlement. Local residents quickly recognized the seriousness of his injuries. An experienced physician provided initial treatment before arranging transfer to a hospital in the nearest city. Investigations later confirmed a broader trend. Brown bears across the Carpathians had increasingly begun using abandoned human-made structures, like old mines and cellars, for shelter. As logging and development disrupted their natural habitats, bears adapted by seeking isolated and quiet spaces underground. Wildlife authorities reviewed the incident and determined the bear had responded instinctively to a perceived threat in its temporary shelter. No further action was taken against the animal. Though Antonescu's physical recovery was swift, the psychological effects took longer to fade. When he returned to the field, he implemented strict new protocols. Remote camera probes were deployed before entering any cave or tunnel, and all expeditions, regardless of familiarity with the site, were done with at least one additional team member. His account of the event, later published in a scientific journal, played a key role in updating national safety guidelines for researchers and conservationists working in bear habitats. The old mine has remained undisturbed since, its shadowed corridors unofficially returned to the wilderness that reclaimed them. Today, Antonescu continues his work with a renewed sense of caution and respect for the unpredictable world beneath the forest floor. His experience is now required reading for new field researchers, serving as a powerful reminder that even the most experienced professionals are never truly alone in the wild. Cassiar Highway, British Columbia, July 8, 2016. Cutting through some of North America's most remote terrain, the Cassiar Highway stretches for 874 kilometers across northern British Columbia, linking it to the Yukon. For much of its route, the two-lane road traverses an immense wilderness. Forested ridgelines, alpine passes, and long, empty valleys where cell coverage vanishes and traffic is a rare occurrence. 42-year-old Emmett Hollingsworth knew this stretch well. A seasoned tradesman, he had worked throughout the northern industrial circuits for over a decade and understood the challenges of traveling through the backcountry. But this trip was different. His 12-year-old daughter Zephyr was with him, visiting his worksite during her summer break. That year, the region was experiencing unseasonably high temperatures. Days climbed above 30 degrees Celsius, even at elevation, and wildlife biologists later noted behavioral shifts among native species. Grizzly bears, in particular, had been sighted in unfamiliar areas, drawn by water sources, roadkill, or in some cases, the smell of food left by passing travelers. Roughly 320 kilometers north of the nearest settlement, with no services for hours in either direction, Emmett's truck began to overheat. Steam rose from the hood. A quick inspection revealed a split radiator hose, a relatively minor failure under normal conditions, but a serious one this far from assistance. There was no phone reception and traffic was sparse. They had seen only 2 other vehicles that day. Emmett began unloading supplies to locate his emergency repair kit. 2 coolers were set aside, one containing perishable food, and bags and camping gear were moved from the cab. As he searched, neither he nor Zephyr noticed the grizzly bear until it emerged silently from the tree line, just off the road behind them. The bear, later identified through tracks and analysis as a mature male weighing approximately 280 kilograms, was likely drawn by the scent of food. It stood at the forest's edge, head high, testing the air. Zephyr spotted it first. Her sudden reaction drew Emmett's attention. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. Staying calm, he instructed his daughter to slowly retreat toward the truck. He attempted to deter the bear by making himself appear larger, waving his arms, shouting, tossing small rocks into the nearby brush. These gestures gave the bear a momentary pause, but they weren't enough to turn it away. Its attention was locked on the open cooler. As the bear began to approach, Emmett knew the priority was safety. He helped Zephyr climb onto the roof of the pickup truck, following quickly behind. From this vantage point, they remained visible but out of immediate reach. What followed was nearly 50 minutes of tense observation. The bear moved with deliberate ease, using its powerful limbs to tear open the cooler, scatter food across the gravel, and crush containers with little effort. It showed minimal interest in the humans watching from above, acknowledging them occasionally with a glance, but never directly threatening them. The midday heat posed a different danger. The sun beat down on the metal roof of the vehicle, quickly turning it into a scorching surface. Zephyr's skin began to redden and blister in places. Emmett gave her his shirt, using it to create a thin barrier between her and the hot metal. Still, the discomfort grew with every passing minute. Eventually, a camper van appeared on the road, heading north. Emmett signaled urgently. The vehicle slowed. Its driver, Reginald Pearson, a retired wilderness ranger, immediately understood the situation. He used the van's horn repeatedly, creating enough noise to unsettle the bear. After a final glance, the animal began to retreat. Not hurriedly, but with the same steady confidence it had shown throughout. It disappeared into the trees. Pearson provided first aid for Zephyr's minor burns and shared water and supplies. Drawing on his experience, he helped Emmett fashion a temporary fix using duct tape and a section of hose from his own vehicle. He then escorted the truck for the remaining 80 kilometers to the nearest fuel stop to ensure they reached safety. Wildlife authorities later reviewed the incident and found that the bear had behaved naturally, drawn by accessible food, not aggression. The site was added to a list of locations for updated safety signage, reminding travelers to secure all food and waste properly, even in areas where bear sightings are infrequent. For Zephyr, the event left more than physical marks. In the weeks that followed, she struggled with sleep and developed anxiety around animal sounds. Even benign wilderness audio, like wind in the trees or a crackling campfire, could spark moments of fear. With counseling and support, she gradually regained confidence. Over time, her experience became a source of strength. She began volunteering with local conservation groups and eventually speaking to youth programs about coexisting with wildlife. Her presentations emphasized preparation, awareness, and respect, not fear. Photographs from that day, captured by Pearson, were later used in public education materials. The story resonated across the province, not as a tale of survival, but as a call for responsibility in shared landscapes. Emmett, when asked in a later interview what he remembered most, didn't speak of the fear or the damage. Instead, he described the bear's quiet presence. What endured most for the Hollingsworths wasn't the destruction or the fear. It was a shift in perspective. The bear had moved with calm assurance, unhurried and unafraid, as if the land itself recognized it. In that moment, it was clear. This was its territory, not theirs. Protected wilderness area in Alaska, August 17, 2013. A remote river in this vast region has long been known as one of the world's premier places to witness brown bears during the salmon run. Each summer, as sockeye salmon return to their ancestral spawning grounds, dozens of massive grizzly bears gather along the river's edge, creating one of the most breathtaking natural spectacles in North America. For wildlife photographers and adventurers alike, watching these powerful animals deftly pull fish from the rushing current offers a quintessential experience of Alaska's wild spirit. For Nathaniel Blackburn, a 44-year-old commercial fisherman from Kodiak Island, this river symbolized more than a photographic opportunity. It was a living laboratory, a place where he could study the behavior of wild salmon and perhaps gain insight into the dwindling salmon returns that had increasingly threatened his livelihood. With specialized permission from land management authorities, Blackburn set up a small temporary research outpost approximately 2 kilometers upstream from the river's more famous waterfall viewing area, a part of the watershed rarely frequented by tourists. The summer of 2013 brought an exceptional surge of salmon to the region. Biologists recorded the highest sockeye return in over 10 years, and the watershed teemed with activity. The abundance of fish, however, also drew in an unusually large number of grizzly bears. Wildlife monitors documented nearly 60 different bears that season, almost twice the average count for that area. On a cool August morning, Blackburn waded into the thigh-deep river to check underwater netting designed to briefly trap salmon for sampling and measurement before their release. His gear was technical and his methods precise, aimed at minimizing disturbance to the riverbed. His research site had been chosen for its relative isolation and safety. Flanked by steep canyon walls and featuring limited access points, the location allowed clear views in both directions. In previous weeks, he had only encountered bears at a distance. But nature is unpredictable. That morning, midway through a routine river crossing, Blackburn heard the unmistakable crack of breaking branches from the upstream forest. A massive male grizzly bear, later identified by field monitors as one of the dominant individuals in the area, emerged from the tree line roughly 40 meters away. The bear, estimated at nearly 480 kilograms, was in his physical prime, muscular, alert, and intensely focused. Biologists would later theorize that this particular bear had been displaced from its preferred fishing grounds by younger rivals and was now exploring alternative sites. Blackburn, caught in the middle of the river, had no time to reach either bank safely. With no other viable option, he scrambled onto a partially submerged fallen tree stretching across part of the channel. The log was slick with moss and river spray, offering little grip or comfort. As the cold water swirled around him, he could only watch as the bear entered the water upstream. To his relief, the bear appeared uninterested in his presence. Instead, the animal's attention was fixed on the salmon hovering just behind the submerged log. With swift, deliberate motions, the bear began fishing, its massive paws slicing through the current with remarkable precision. In one clean strike, it snatched a salmon from the water and tossed it onto a nearby boulder. For the next 20 minutes, Blackburn remained completely still, his muscles tensing with fatigue and his soaked gear drawing the chill deeper into his bones. The bear moved methodically, focusing on the task of feeding. Every sense was heightened for Blackburn: the scent of wet fur, the scrape of claws on stone, the subtle changes in current. Each detail etched itself into his memory. Eventually, the bear moved further upstream, vanishing around a curve in the canyon. Still uncertain whether it might return, Blackburn remained motionless on the log for several more minutes. Only when the silence grew long and steady did he descend carefully and make his way to shore, his legs trembling from both the cold and the release of tension. Back at his camp, he reported the encounter to park headquarters via radio. A ranger advised him to relocate his equipment closer to regularly patrolled areas and noted that this particular bear had recently exhibited increased aggression, possibly due to an injury sustained in a territorial altercation with a younger male. Surveillance photos later showed a visible wound on the bear's shoulder, consistent with such a struggle. Though not life-threatening, the injury may have explained the bear's deviation from more competitive fishing zones. Blackburn finished his research session without further incident and left the area 3 days later. Before departing, he stopped by the ranger station, where staff shared more photos and observations about the bear. The experience left a lasting impression, not of danger, but of humility. In the years that followed, Blackburn returned to salmon research across Alaska. Though he continued his work, he never again conducted field operations alone in bear territory. His findings contributed to improved fishery management in multiple districts, influencing both policy and conservation efforts. During presentations to state officials and fellow researchers, he often opened with the story of that fateful morning, not as a tale of survival, but as a reflection on the delicate balance between human presence and wild ecosystems. He described how, in that frozen moment on the log, he understood something profound. The bear had not perceived him as a threat, a rival, or even as food. He was simply part of the scenery, irrelevant to the bear's purpose. This realization shifted his perspective on nature itself. It wasn't about control or strength. Survival often depended on stillness, observation, and restraint. Blackburn's reflections became central to his educational outreach. He often spoke of the log not just as a piece of wood, but as a symbol of coexistence. For him, it represented the silent contract between human and wild, a space where fear and respect could coexist without conflict. In every story, he emphasized that stewardship of the natural world must come from a place of reverence, not dominance. Years later, as he continued to work on rivers across the region, Blackburn's thoughts often returned to that canyon, that bear, and that moment of absolute stillness. In a world increasingly shaped by human expansion, his message remained clear. In the wilderness, humility is not a weakness, it is survival.
Elliot Brandt had been running the Kananaskis Ridge Run for 6 straight years, pushing his body across high-altitude trails that twisted through alpine forests and hugged the edge of cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet into valleys carved by time and water. It was a grueling course that drew some of the toughest trail runners from across the region, people who thrived on challenge, solitude, and the rush of racing through raw, untamed terrain. At 38, Elliot was lean, fast, and familiar with the course, having trained there every summer. He was leading the pack that morning, his breath even, his mind focused, his legs still strong despite the long climb behind him. The wind was sharp and clean, the trees were thick with summer green, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the steady rhythm of his breathing. As he reached a narrow switchback halfway through the second leg of the run, he pushed hard into the turn, his eyes scanning the path for roots or loose rock, his momentum carrying him fast around the bend. What waited for him on the other side was not terrain, fatigue, or cramp, but something wild, ancient, and utterly indifferent to the world of marathons and medals. Less than 15 feet ahead, a massive grizzly bear stood tall on all fours, her fur dark and thick, her muscles tensed. Flanking her on either side were two cubs, barely the size of mid-sized dogs, their eyes fixed on him in frozen curiosity. The instant Elliot appeared, the bear reacted, not with curiosity or retreat, but with sudden fury born from instinct and the urgent need to protect. She charged straight at him with terrifying speed, her paws pounding the trail, her growl erupting like thunder through the trees. Elliot didn't have time to think. He tried to pivot, to leap to the side, but the space was narrow, and the bear was already upon him. Her front paw hit him square in the side, claws raking through his shirt, the impact breaking bone brutally and sending him sprawling into the brush beside the trail. He landed hard on his back, pain blooming across his chest and down his arm. Before he could rise, she was there, looming above him, jaws open wide. Her teeth clamped down on his shoulder, crushing muscle and tearing skin, and then she began to drag him into the undergrowth, away from the trail, away from the open. The trees closed in around them as she pulled him several feet into the brush, her growls low and guttural, her massive head jerking side to side as she tried to control him without killing him outright. His legs kicked weakly against the ground, his good hand flailing for something to hold onto, but the pain was blinding and the weight of her was suffocating. Somewhere farther up the trail, other runners heard the screaming but couldn't see what was happening. The thick turns and drops in elevation kept them blind, and by the time anyone got close, the forest had already swallowed him and the bear. No one dared rush forward. They stood frozen, listening, waiting, some shouting for help, others pulling out phones with shaking hands. Back in the brush, Elliot could barely move. Blood soaked his shirt, pooling beneath his back. The bear paced over him, snorting loudly, her body tense and twitching, her cubs lingering nearby. She wasn't attacking anymore, but she wasn't leaving either. She watched him, sniffed the air, and let out sharp huffs of warning to anyone nearby. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, his breath short and uneven. He knew not to move, not to provoke her further. He lay still, covered in leaves and dirt and blood, blinking slowly, every nerve in his body screaming while he tried to stay conscious. Time passed in a haze, and every second stretched out heavy with dread. The bear remained above him for hours, though it was less than 10 minutes. Eventually, something shifted. Maybe she heard the others calling, the wind carried a sound from the ridge, or perhaps she simply decided he was no longer a threat. She turned toward her cubs and grunted, then began walking slowly, deliberately, deeper into the trees. The cubs followed, glancing at the motionless figure lying broken in the brush. When the bear was gone, silence returned to the woods, broken only by Elliot's ragged breathing and the distant voices of the runners creeping forward with caution. Paramedics were dispatched immediately, but it took nearly 40 minutes to reach him because of the remote location and rough terrain. By the time help arrived, Elliot was awake but weak, his body broken in multiple places. His left arm was shattered, his shoulder torn open, and blood loss had left his skin pale and clammy, but he was alive. They stabilized him and carried him back to a waiting emergency team, who airlifted him to the nearest hospital. The race was canceled when the attack was confirmed, and news of the incident spread fast through the trail running community. Wildlife officers were deployed to monitor the area, but no action was taken against the bear, which had acted in defense of her young. The incident became one of the most harrowing bear encounters in the history of the Kananaskis region. Elliot spent weeks in recovery, undergoing surgery and rehabilitation. He regained use of his arm eventually, though with permanent nerve damage and limited strength. The scars on his shoulder remained deep and visible, a daily reminder of how quickly things could turn in the wilderness. He never returned to competitive running again. He still hiked, still loved the outdoors, but the joy of running alone on forest trails had been replaced by a quiet respect for the animals that lived there, and a memory he would never forget. The air in the remote wilderness of British Columbia was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. But within a small, quiet campground nestled between towering evergreens, The peace was on the verge of being shattered by a terrifying force of nature. Karen, a woman in her early 40s who had ventured into the forest seeking solitude and adventure, was resting inside her luxury SUV after a long day of hiking. She had parked beneath a dense canopy of trees, taking care to set up camp carefully and enjoy the stillness. The vehicle was stocked with food, most of it packed in sealed containers and bags, but the lingering aroma inside was enough to attract a presence neither expected nor wanted. As Karen drifted into a light sleep, a sudden crash of breaking glass and heavy thuds against the vehicle's metal frame jolted her awake, snapping her from dream state to raw terror in a heartbeat. In a matter of seconds, a massive grizzly bear had smashed through the windshield, sending shards of glass across the seats and dashboard. The bear's immense bulk pressed against the shattered window frame, its claws raking deep gouges into the leather and plastic interior as it clawed and bit with frantic force. Drawn by hunger and frustrated by the scent of food just out of reach, the bear displayed aggressive behavior driven by desperation. It showed no hesitation as it tore through the fragile barrier between itself and Karen. Trapped in the confined space, Karen was pinned against the seat by the animal's enormous head and powerful forelimbs as it reached through the broken window, swiping at her with claws that cut like knives. Pain erupted in her right arm as the claws dug deep into muscle and flesh, leaving burning wounds that bled freely onto the torn fabric of her jacket. Despite the shock and agony, her mind remained focused. Panic threatened to take hold, but she fought to remain calm, knowing that losing control could mean losing everything. The bear's hot breath filled the interior, accompanied by the sounds of glass crunching under its weight and the crack of plastic yielding to brute strength. Each violent movement of the animal was a reminder of her imminent danger. With trembling hands, she reached for the door lock, her fingers slick with blood yet determined to escape. At first, the door resisted, its frame twisted from the bear's attack, but after several agonizing seconds it gave way. Karen pushed it open, wincing as the bear's claws brushed her arm once more. The moment she was free, she crawled onto the muddy ground, scrambling backward through the dirt and pine needles, her voice rising in a raw, desperate cry for help. The bear advanced for a moment, snarling, but was soon distracted by the sudden eruption of sound and light from nearby campers who had heard the commotion. The once quiet campground became a frenzy of action. Metal pots banged loudly, bear spray hissed through the air, and voices called out urgent warnings. Campers acted quickly, defending themselves and diverting the bear's attention away from Karen. Confused and agitated by the assault of noise and light, the bear growled in protest, but gradually began to back away. It limped slightly, a possible result of its own violent encounter with the vehicle, and retreated into the shadowy forest, vanishing into the thick underbrush. Nearby campers rushed to Karen's side as she collapsed, clutching her injured arm and trembling in the wake of the attack. Her wounds were serious, but thanks to the quick response of others, she had survived what could have been a fatal encounter. Emergency responders arrived within the hour and transported her to the nearest medical facility. There, surgeons worked to clean and treat the deep gashes and puncture wounds, stitching torn skin and muscle, and administering antibiotics to prevent infection. The physical damage was extensive, but her ability to remain composed in the moment had been vital in minimizing the consequences. Recovery would be long and painful, both physically and emotionally, as the memories of that night clung to her mind like scars. In the aftermath, word of the attack spread swiftly through local outdoor communities and regional wilderness authorities. Advisories were issued, urging campers and hikers to adopt stricter precautions when storing food and managing campsites. Officials highlighted a growing concern. Grizzly bears were venturing closer to human settlements in search of food, driven by habitat loss and seasonal scarcity. As natural food sources declined, these animals were becoming increasingly bold and dangerous. The incident served as a stark warning. Even in well-maintained wilderness areas, the balance between human activity and wildlife could tip dramatically with little notice. Authorities reiterated the need for bear-proof storage containers, suspended food caches, and vigilant campsite hygiene. Leaving food or packaging unattended, even inside vehicles, could result in dire consequences. Campers were cautioned to avoid preparing or eating food near sleeping areas and to remain alert, especially in regions with recent bear sightings. Wildlife experts examining the event observed that the bear's behavior aligned with that of an animal driven by extreme hunger rather than typical aggression. It was noted that bears conditioned to associate human spaces with food gradually lose their natural caution, increasing the likelihood of violent interactions. They warned that without intervention and improved coexistence strategies, these situations would only become more common. Karen's ordeal became the subject of study among park officials and wildlife biologists, who cited her case as an example of escalating human-wildlife conflict. Her SUV, now badly damaged and littered with claw marks and broken glass, stood as a physical reminder of the night's terror. Yet the deeper impact remained in her spirit, where fear and trauma occasionally resurfaced in vivid flashes. Nightmares and anxiety episodes followed her into the weeks and months of recovery. Even so, there emerged within her a quiet determination to heal and to use her story as a cautionary tale. By sharing her experience, she hoped to educate others about the real dangers of wilderness exploration and the critical importance of respecting the boundaries between civilization and the wild. The Chantar Islands were cold, windswept, and unreachable for half the year. Summer brought short days of gray skies, biting insects, and just enough warmth to thaw the edges of the sea. On June 1, 2025, 3 workers, Mira, Pavel, and Lena, huddled in the dim shelter on Bolshoi Chantar Island, where they ran a seasonal animal rehabilitation outpost. Mira, 33, was a former vet nurse with a gentle voice and worn hands. Pavel, 44, had worked on Arctic expeditions and moved with the calmness of someone used to danger. Lena, just 26, was the newest, still learning how quickly things could turn in the wild. Their shelter stood near the tree line, tucked away from the wind but close enough to the beach for supply drops. They cared for 13 sled dogs, abandoned after a failed racing season, and several rescued seabirds. The dogs were caged near the back, and the birds were in crates inside the main cabin. They'd gotten too comfortable, lulled into routine, believing that the island's harsh beauty came with a degree of safety. But that night, someone had forgotten to secure the latch on the food storage shed. It was enough. Around midnight, the wind shifted, and the dogs grew restless, their whines rising into anxious barks. Something massive moved through the trees, slow and heavy, drawn by the smell of meat and kibble. The Russian Grizzly lumbered from the woods, likely old and starving after a failed spring hunt. Over 7 feet tall and gaunt from winter, it had deep scars across its muzzle and shoulders. Its coat was patchy, its breath steaming in the cold air as it shoved its weight against the thin wooden wall of the storage shed. The door cracked, hinges popped. The bear burst inside. The crashing wood snapped the night apart. Mira sat up in her bunk in the main cabin, disoriented. Lena, sleeping in the adjacent room, froze under her blanket. Pavel had been checking traps in the dusk and returned just minutes earlier, still dressed. He first grabbed his headlamp and moved toward the dog's enclosure to investigate the noise. The dogs were going wild now, howling and snapping in panic. Having devoured a few bags of feed in the shed, the bear moved toward the scent of live meat. It smashed through the back fence in a roar of splinters. Dogs scattered, their cages offering no protection. The grizzly crushed one dog in its jaws and slammed another into the ground with a swipe that shattered bone. Pavel reached the enclosure seconds too late. He shouted, then waved his arms, trying to distract the bear. The beam of his headlamp caught its eyes, and the animal turned with terrifying speed. The bear charged, closing the distance in seconds. It hit Pavel like a boulder, knocking him flat and biting down on his shoulder, dragging him through the snow and muck. He didn't have time to scream. Inside the cabin, Mira bolted upright, realized what was happening, and scrambled to grab the emergency satellite radio. She shoved it into her coat, yelling for Lena, but Lena had already fled into the crawl space attic, the only lockable space in the building. Mira followed, pulling the ladder behind her as the bear's roar echoed outside. Below them, the bear crashed through the shelter wall, drawn by the scent of birds and humans. It tossed over crates, sending feathers and blood into the air. It knocked shelves aside and mauled 2 more dogs that had sought shelter inside. Pressed against the wooden beams, Mira could hear the animal's breath below. She whispered into the radio, sending fragments of her location to the mainland, her voice shaking as she tried to remain unheard. But then Lena, unable to keep still in the cramped attic and driven by panic, shifted too far toward the edge. A sudden groan of wood beneath her weight gave way with a crack. She tumbled through a weak spot in the boards and crashed onto the floor below. The bear was on her in seconds. Mira clamped her hands over her mouth as Lena's final screams were cut short in the chaos. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the bear's movements and the occasional dying cry of an animal below. The attic floor was thin, the wood groaning under even Mira's still weight. She kept whispering into the radio until the battery died just before dawn. Outside, the wind picked up. The bear, tired and blood-stained, moved in and out of the building, pacing the ruins, pushing at the walls as if expecting more resistance. The dogs were dead or gone. The seabirds had stopped screeching. The shelter stank of blood, fur, and splintered wood. Somewhere around 6 in the morning, the bear wandered into the trees to rest, belly swollen with stolen meat. The silence stretched until late morning. Then, the distant whir of helicopter blades broke across the treetops. Rangers had picked up Mira's message and flown out, landing near the edge of the compound, rifles raised as they stepped into the carnage. The shelter looked like a war zone. Blood smeared every surface. The rear fence had collapsed. Pavel's body lay outside, torn open near the dogs' pens. They found Lena's remains inside the house, mauled almost beyond recognition. But somehow, Mira had survived. When the Rangers opened the attic door, she didn't move at first, just blinked at them in silence. She was alone now, the only one left. It took another hour to find the bear, resting in a shallow dip near the ridge, covered in gore, unafraid even as the men raised their rifles. It didn't run when they shot. It simply slumped and exhaled. Back at the compound, only 5 dogs remained alive, scattered in the woods or hiding under overturned crates. Most of the seabirds were dead, feathers and blood coating the floor. The shelter would never reopen. The tragedy was blamed on food stress and human error. A missing latch, a hungry predator, an isolated outpost too far for quick rescue. The authorities issued a brief statement, but those who saw the aftermath said there was no mistaking the bear's fury. It hadn't just killed to eat. It had destroyed everything in its path, whether from hunger, madness, or instinct. It had torn apart a place built to heal. And in the ruins of that hope, only one survivor remained to carry the memory of that long, frozen night. Derek Fallon was 33, a lifelong athlete and ultramarathoner who found solace in early morning trail runs through the mist-laced forests of western North Carolina. He lived near Brevard and worked remotely as a graphic designer, often beginning his days with long jogs along Forest Service roads and hidden footpaths winding through a national forest in the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina. That May morning, the sky was still dark as he tied his shoes, slipped on his hydration pack, and set off just before 5 a.m., earbuds in and music low. The air was cool and heavy with fog, which clung to the mossy ground and blurred the outlines of tree trunks. Derek knew these trails well. He ran them daily, using the climbs to push his limits and the downhills to feel weightless. He had no idea that less than 100 yards up the path, a black bear sow and her 2 cubs had bedded down for the night in a shallow hollow beside a thicket of mountain laurel. The bear had likely caught Derek's scent early, but with the shifting breeze and the softness of his footfalls, she didn't flee. Instead, she stayed alert, uneasy. The cubs moved nearby, playing among logs and roots. Derek, oblivious, jogged uphill toward them, each step closing the distance under the blanket of morning haze. He passed within 20 feet of the thicket at the bend in the trail. The bear charged without warning. The first thing Derek registered was a deep rustling to his right, louder than a deer. He turned and saw a blur of dark fur exploding from the brush. Before he could stop, the bear barreled into him. The impact lifted him off the trail and drove him into the wet ground. His earbuds ripped free. Pain exploded in his thigh as teeth sank deep, puncturing through muscle. Then came a slashing blow across his back, claws raking down through his shirt, tearing skin and flesh. He screamed, flailing beneath the bear's weight, kicking as he rolled. His leg burned, his back felt on fire. The bear loomed above him, jaws dripping with blood and breath hot against his cheek. But behind them, the cubs squealed and shifted, drawing the sow's attention. She hesitated, then she backed off. It wasn't mercy. It was instinct. Hearing her cubs move in panic, the sow turned from the struggling runner and vanished into the brush with a low huff, leaving a trail of crushed ferns and branches. Derek was alone again, bleeding, face pressed into damp soil. For seconds, he didn't move. His leg throbbed with a deep, nauseating ache. His back burned with each breath. He rolled onto his side and fumbled for his smartwatch with shaking fingers. Blood smeared the screen as he pressed the emergency beacon, triggering a distress signal linked to his phone and a location marker. Then he lay still, heart hammering, eyes locked on the forest around him. It took nearly an hour for rescuers to arrive. Rangers, guided by GPS, found him barely conscious, curled beside the trail in a pool of blood and mud. His running shorts were shredded, soaked red, and his hydration pack was torn. They stabilized him quickly, applied pressure to his thigh, and wrapped his torso in gauze. The evacuation was fast but rough. Miles of uneven trail had to be covered with a stretcher before a helicopter could reach a clearing nearby. At the hospital, surgeons worked for hours. The bite had torn through muscle and nicked an artery in his leg. His back had multiple deep lacerations that required stitches and left him at risk of infection. Doctors were optimistic, but recovery would be slow. The story spread quickly. It shocked the local fitness community. Trail runners, cyclists, and hikers who had long considered the forests peaceful at dawn. But wildlife officers quickly clarified. The bear hadn't hunted him. It had reacted to a perceived threat, triggered by surprise and proximity in poor light. The sow likely thought he was a predator moving in fast on her cubs. Derek later recalled that he had never seen the bear until it was on him. There had been no time to think, no time to react. One moment he was running, the next he was fighting to stay conscious, trying to breathe through pain and confusion while blood soaked the earth. The Forest Service responded by issuing no-run advisories during spring cub season in high-traffic bear areas. Warning signs were posted at popular trailheads, and volunteer groups handed out flyers urging people to avoid dawn and dusk runs, especially alone. Rangers reminded the public that while black bears were less aggressive than grizzlies, they were still wild animals, and sows with cubs could be terrifyingly fast and dangerously unpredictable when startled. Derek spent weeks in recovery. The wounds healed, but he was left with long scars down his back and a deep, permanent groove along his thigh. He lost some mobility in that leg and dealt with phantom pain for months. He'd once dreamed of qualifying for the Leadville 100 ultramarathon, but that goal now seemed distant. Still, he didn't abandon the forest entirely. After therapy and rehab, he began walking the same trails again, slowly, during daylight, and with more awareness than ever before. The silence of the woods no longer comforted him in the same way. It now carried memory, but he still respected the wild, understood that what had happened wasn't malevolence. It was instinct colliding with motion. He kept the smartwatch that saved his life, its cracked screen now a reminder more powerful than any scar. And on the days he did return to the trails, he went without earbuds. He listened. The trees creaked, birds called, leaves moved in the wind, and always, somewhere deeper in the green, silence waited. Officer Daniel Reyes had spent 15 years serving rural communities across western Montana. At 39, he was known among the department as calm, sharp, and always the one to volunteer for the roughest assignments. That June morning, his unit had been sent deep into the Swan Range after a hiker was reported missing 2 days prior. A storm had passed the night before, soaking the forest and erasing any obvious trail. It was rugged country, dense, steep, and home to bears. The search team comprised 6 officers, 2 local volunteers, and a pair of dogs. Reyes led them single file up a narrow game trail, carved through thick spruce and tangled willows. The dogs pulled at their leads, noses twitching. The team pushed forward slowly, scanning ravines and checking gullies for signs of movement or discarded gear. The morning air was heavy with pine, and the only sound was boots in wet dirt and the quiet calls of ravens overhead. After an hour, Reyes paused at a bend where the ground opened to a small clearing. Scattered along the trail were bones, fresh elk remains, blood still slick on the ribcage. Some had been torn clean, others gnawed. Reyes crouched and studied them briefly, noting drag marks that led into the brush. He thought the kill looked recent, maybe within the past day. He stood, turned, and gestured for caution. But before the warning left his lips, the willows exploded before them. The grizzly came fast. No growl, no sound, just an eruption of muscle and brown fur from the undergrowth. The bear had likely been bedding down near the carcass, and now, in a split second, it reacted as if defending a meal from thieves. The distance between them vanished in a heartbeat. Reyes was at the front, exposed and closest. The bear hit him hard, one paw across the shoulder, knocking him off his feet and onto his back. Before anyone could move, the grizzly lunged again, jaws closing over Reyes' upper chest. Bones cracked audibly. Its head shook violently. Blood sprayed into the ferns. Officers behind scrambled to raise their rifles, some fumbling with safeties, others paralyzed by shock. The bear let out a short huff. Jaws clamped around Reyes' neck, then grabbed his limp body by the vest and dragged him backward, disappearing into the brush with a terrifying, brutal efficiency. The team broke their silence. A rifle fired, a warning shot into the air. Another followed, echoing through the canyon walls. The bear reappeared for a split second in the brush, eyes wide and mouth red, then vanished again, crashing deeper into cover. Reyes' body was left slumped 10 feet from the trail, half covered in broken branches. Medics rushed in immediately, dropping beside him. His chest was torn open. The wounds were too deep, the bleeding too fast. He had been alive for only a minute or two after the initial attack, long enough to choke on blood and fade before help could reach him. One of the officers dropped to his knees nearby, hands pressed to his helmet, shoulders shaking. Another stood staring, rifle held useless at his side. The medics tried compressions and clamping wounds, but it was already over. They called it in. "Officer down, fatal bear attack." The radio hissed as the signal echoed through repeaters back to base. The forest was silent again, but the air hung thick with iron and grief. The team secured the area for the next hour, posted guards along the perimeter, and waited quietly. Wildlife agents arrived with tranquilizers and bear dogs. They tracked the grizzly for most of the afternoon, but halted pursuit after signs suggested it had fled the area entirely. They analyzed the scene and determined the bear's behavior wasn't predatory. It had been startled, its food threatened, and it reacted on instinct. That didn't make the result easier to bear. Reyes' body was flown out by helicopter that evening. Officers stood in a line, silent as the stretcher passed. Some removed their hats. One of the volunteers who'd joined the search had gone pale and refused to speak for hours after. The investigation concluded 2 weeks later. Wildlife officials confirmed the grizzly was a mature adult male, most likely food-stressed from a harsh spring. It had not sought out the officers, only responded to a perceived threat near its kill. They chose not to hunt it down because it retreated and had no record of previous aggression. It had acted like any wild bear would when startled while feeding. Daniel Reyes' funeral drew officers from across 3 states. The town of Kalispell lowered flags to half-mast, and dozens of locals lined the streets in silent tribute as the procession passed. His wife stood beside the chief, holding the folded flag, eyes fixed forward. At the trailhead where the team had entered that morning, a memorial was later installed, simple, carved in stone, bearing his name and badge number. The attack haunted the surviving officers. Some sought counseling. Others returned to the field quickly, needing to face the wild again before fear settled in too deep. They all remembered how fast it happened, how sudden, how helpless they'd felt when the forest turned against them in those few seconds. It remained one of the rare fatal attacks on law enforcement by a wild animal in U.S. history. Not because the team lacked training or awareness, but because nature offers no guarantees, and wild predators don't weigh consequences. They react. Even seasoned teams, armed and prepared, aren't immune when walking into a feeding site, blind to what waits beneath the brush. In the months that followed, new protocols were established. Search teams now avoided game trails showing fresh kill. Officers were retrained in fast react drills and given better non-lethal deterrence. But no one forgot the silence that followed Reyes' final breath, or the thud of the bear as it vanished back into the trees. His last act had been to lead, to take point up a trail that seemed ordinary until it wasn't. He never had the chance to raise his weapon, never had time to shout. In that wild corner of Montana, the line between safety and death proved as thin as a branch in the wind, and just as easy to snap. Trevor Holt had spent nearly 2 decades working as a wildlife officer in Alaska. At 42, he was experienced, respected, and known for keeping a steady hand during high-risk encounters. That June morning, The air was calm, and the forest around them was silent, except for the occasional rustle through spruce. Trevor and his partner, Miles Darnell, were deep in the hills of Kodiak Island, tracking a large female bear for a GPS collar study to improve conservation patterns. They had located the sow near a berry thicket at dawn. She was massive, likely over 700 pounds, heavy with spring forage and muscle from long winter fasting. They waited for the perfect angle from a ridge above, then fired the dart into her shoulder with practiced precision. Within minutes, she staggered and collapsed in a patch of low brush, breathing heavily, but unmoving. The standard protocol gave them 10 minutes before the approach. They waited 12, watching through binoculars as the sow's chest rose and fell more slowly. Confident in the sedation, they descended through the undergrowth, equipment ready. Trevor knelt by the bear's head while Miles moved toward the hindquarters with the collar and tools. The first signs of trouble came almost unnoticed. The bear's ear twitched, then her back leg shivered once, lightly. Trevor noticed but assumed it was a postural reflex, common enough even under full sedation. He reached forward and began securing the strap around her thick neck, guiding it past the fur matted with old mud and tangled grass. Then the bear's eyes opened. There was no delay, no warning growl or drawn-out stir. She exploded from the forest floor in one powerful motion, jaws wide, eyes wild with panic. The sedative had not finished its job. She was disoriented, partially numb, but awake enough to react with instinct and fear. Trevor didn't even have time to move before she lunged forward and slammed him backward into the base of a spruce tree. His breath was knocked out as his back struck the trunk, the force of her weight driving bark into his spine. She pinned him there with both front paws, her claws pressing deep through his jacket. He tried to scream, but the air had fled his lungs. Pain surged down his ribs, his thigh, his arm. Her claws raked down his side, catching muscle and slicing through fabric. Miles froze for a second in pure shock. Then instinct kicked in. He reached for the flare gun holstered at his belt, snapped the safety, and fired upward. The red flare hissed over the canopy with a high-pitched whistle, bursting in a flash of light just above the treetops. The sow flinched, her head whipping sideways. She roared, a low, confused bellow that shook the brush, and staggered off Trevor, swiping the ground as she turned in a dazed circle. Her movements were jerky and sluggish now, the tranquilizer fighting to regain its grip as her blood pumped harder from adrenaline. She stumbled into a thicket and disappeared, crashing through branches like a ghost fleeing fire. Trevor slumped to the ground, blood soaking through his uniform. His back was torn open along one shoulder blade. His thigh pulsed with warmth, wet and sticky with deep wounds that ran jagged along the muscle. He blinked slowly, struggling to stay conscious. Miles was already at his side, calling for medevac on the satellite radio with shaking hands. The chopper arrived 40 minutes later. By then, Miles had packed gauze into the worst wounds and done what he could with a field tourniquet and pressure wrap. Trevor drifted in and out of awareness, whispering fragmented thoughts, his face pale. The crew lifted him into the cabin and took off into the sky, rotor blades thundering as they rose over the forest. At the hospital in Anchorage, surgeons worked for hours. The bear's claws had punctured deep near the spine, narrowly missing vital organs. One gash across the thigh required reconstructive surgery. The infections that followed made recovery even harder. He spent a month in the trauma unit, slipping between pain and medication. Each night, he'd dream of the bear's breath on his face and the flash of her eyes in the green light of morning. The department launched a full review of the tagging operation. They confirmed the sedative dosage was appropriate for the bear's estimated weight, but not for her size. She was far heavier than predicted, and her metabolism burned through the drug too quickly. It was a sobering failure that sent ripples through wildlife offices across Alaska. Protocols were rewritten, tagging approaches were delayed longer, equipment was updated, but none of that erased the moment the bear opened her eyes. Despite the injuries and the trauma, Trevor never blamed the animal. He said later, during a debrief, that the bear had been as scared as he was. She had woken up confused, unable to move right, unable to understand what was happening, and had lashed out in the only way she knew. That understanding didn't dull the pain, but it helped him heal. By late fall, he was walking again, limping slightly but determined. He nodded without hesitation when asked if he'd return to bear duty. It wasn't bravado or stubbornness, it was respect. He had spent his life studying wild animals and knew they weren't villains. That bear hadn't wanted to hurt him. It had simply acted as any wild creature would when fear collided with instinct in a moment of chaos. The tree where he was pinned still bore the marks, bark stripped, a gouge at chest height where the bear had pushed. Miles returned to the site once that summer, alone, and stood there for a long time.
He found one claw mark in the dirt near a dropped tool and picked it up like a relic. The sow was seen later that season via a different camera trap. She'd survived, uncollared, her path unknown. Some thought she should have been tracked down, possibly removed, but Trevor disagreed. He believed she'd earned her space, just like he'd earned his scars. In the wild, no script holds. Timing shifts, doses fail, instincts clash. The bear didn't know the science. She only knew fear, and in that moment, so did he.
Porcupine Creek Canyon, nestled deep within the rugged backcountry of southwestern Montana, had been Wesley Thornton's second home for more than 3 decades. At 58, he was a revered figure among the region's outdoor professionals, a traditional hunting guide whose reputation was built on an impeccable safety record, unwavering discipline, and a profound respect for the natural world. Thornton's outfitting company embodied a no-frills ethos grounded in precise knowledge of the high country wilderness, and it was consistently booked years in advance by hunters who valued expertise and reliability above all else. The arrival of autumn transformed the Montana mountains with striking intensity. By late September, golden aspen groves blazed across the valleys, while the first dustings of snow began to cling to shaded ridges and rocky outcrops. For seasoned guides like Thornton, these seasonal markers carried deeper significance than mere beauty. They signaled shifting patterns of wildlife behavior, particularly among the area's increasing population of apex predators, bears, mountain lions, and wolves responding to the encroaching winter and dwindling food sources. Thornton's final client of the season was a 53-year-old orthopedic surgeon from the upper Midwest. Though an experienced hunter with over 20 years pursuing game across the continent, this was his first expedition into wilderness territory, known for large predators. At the trailhead on the first morning, Thornton delivered his customary safety briefing. Without uttering a word aloud, his methodical actions conveyed everything. Careful demonstration of deterrent spray use, rigorous scent control measures, and a strict emphasis on constant vigilance when moving through dense forest or open alpine meadows. It was a tacit understanding. Respect the wilderness, respect its dangers. The first 4 days of the expedition unfolded smoothly. Game signs were abundant, weather conditions favorable, and the client proved both capable and respectful of the environment. On the 5th day, conditions were nearly ideal. Cool air, steady wind, and low cloud cover combined to keep animals active and visible. By mid-morning, the client harvested a mature bull elk in a quiet alpine meadow located roughly 8 miles from their base camp, a remote site chosen for its strategic vantage and relative seclusion. What followed was a physically demanding yet routine task, field dressing the elk and preparing the meat for transport. Thornton approached the work with his characteristic precision, carefully ensuring the meat would cool efficiently by spreading tarps over shaded ground and securing the area from scavengers. Neither man suspected the unseen consequence of their activity. The scent of fresh blood had traveled down the canyon, carried on the crisp wind, and acted as an unintentional signal to a nearby predator. Wildlife officials later determined that a young adult male bear, struggling to prepare for hibernation after an unusually dry summer, had been drawn to the scent. The bear's natural forage had been drastically reduced, and competition from other predators further restricted scavenging opportunities. Faced with scarcity, the animal's behavior grew desperate and uncharacteristic. The first warning of imminent danger came from the horses tethered near the clearing's edge. They shifted uneasily and emitted distressed vocalizations. Thornton immediately recognized the signs, his gaze sweeping the surrounding tree line. Emerging from a dense stand of pines, the bear stepped into view, just over 40 meters away, nostrils flaring as it locked onto the scent. Without hesitation, Thornton moved to place himself between the bear and his client. He drew a revolver he had carried for years, but had never previously needed to use in defense. The bear's posture left no room for doubt. This was no casual investigation. It was a deliberate, aggressive advance. When the bear closed to 20 meters, Thornton fired a warning shot into the ground. The thunderous report echoed through the canyon, yet the animal remained undeterred. Instead, the sound seemed to trigger an escalation. The bear dropped its head and charged with terrifying speed and force. The attack came swiftly, the collision sending Thornton backward, his body pounding the earth beneath the bear's enormous weight. The assault lasted less than 2 minutes, but was brutal beyond measure. Nearby, the client remained frozen, obeying silent commands to stay still despite a primal urge to flee. The sounds of crashing limbs, guttural breaths, and raw violence filled the air. Eventually, the bear tore away a large portion of the elk and vanished into the forest. Thornton, grievously wounded, was still alive. The client's instincts took over. He rushed to his guide's side, immediately attending to deep lacerations across Thornton's torso and neck, a puncture wound in his upper leg, and severe blood loss. Using supplies from their emergency kit, he stabilized the wounds and activated a satellite beacon to summon rescue. Rescue teams arrived just over 90 minutes later. A helicopter touched down nearby and paramedics administered treatment in the field. Thornton remained conscious throughout, even offering a final piece of practical advice rooted in experience before the airlift. Despite the swift response, he succumbed to internal trauma during the flight, passing away before reaching the nearest emergency facility. Wildlife officers tracked and humanely euthanized the bear several days later. DNA analysis confirmed its involvement in the attack. Further examination revealed the animal was severely malnourished and suffering from an infected wound, likely sustained during a previous encounter with hunters. These compounding factors appeared to have driven its abnormal and aggressive behavior. The tragedy sent ripples through outdoor and hunting communities across the region. Although Thornton had acted strictly according to established protocol, his death sparked urgent re-evaluation of field practices. Within 6 months, new regulations took effect in multiple wilderness areas. These included mandatory use of scent-proof storage containers and requirements that all field dressing take place at a safe distance from camps or kill sites. At the remote trailhead where the expedition had begun, a modest bronze plaque now commemorates Wesley Thornton's life. His name became synonymous with integrity, expertise, and a quiet, unwavering reverence for the wild places he loved. In the months following the incident, the surviving client established a non-profit foundation in Thornton's honor. The organization provides safety training, wilderness education, and deterrent equipment to hunters and hikers traveling through predator-inhabited backcountry. Its mission is clear: to equip future travelers with knowledge and tools that foster greater awareness and respect for the complex ecosystems they explore. Wesley Thornton's legacy endures not only in memorials and stories, but in the informed caution carried by those who venture into the same wild spaces, places where awe and danger exist side by side, demanding respect and preparedness from all who enter. Lake Gogebic, Michigan, February 3, 2009. In the depths of winter, Michigan's Upper Peninsula becomes a realm of silence and snowdrift. Lake Gogebic, the largest natural inland lake in the region, freezes to a solid sheet of ice by February, thick enough to support vehicles, snowmobiles, and the makeshift villages of ice fishing shelters that appear each year like clockwork. To those who lived here or returned annually, it was a place of solitude, challenge, and seasonal ritual. Thaddeus Kowalczyk, a 36-year-old tradesman from a lakeside town further east, was among the dedicated few who braved this icy expanse each year. Ice fishing wasn't just a pastime for him. It was tradition, solitude, and a brief reprieve from the demands of modern life. He set out alone in early February, as he always did, with a custom-rigged snowmobile, a portable ice shelter, and provisions for a full week on the ice. The winter of 2009 was unforgiving. Temperatures stayed well below -20 degrees Celsius, with frequent wind gusts that made exposed skin sting in seconds. Kowalczyk's shelter, insulated and fitted with a small propane heater, offered relative comfort against the deep freeze. He had set up 2 kilometers from the nearest shoreline, an area known to local anglers for consistent walleye and perch activity. Wildlife experts would later point to the unusual behavior of black bears that winter. With milder mid-season thaws followed by abrupt cold snaps, hibernation patterns were disrupted. Some bears, confused by the erratic climate and struggling with limited food, had resumed wandering despite the deadly cold. Few people considered bears a threat in February, but nature, as it turned out, wasn't following the rules that year. On February 2nd, Kowalczyk had a banner day. 8 keeper walleye and a large northern pike came through the ice. As usual, he cleaned the fish outside and discarded the remains in nearby abandoned holes, thinking little of it. The scent, however, lingered on the wind. By 5 a.m. the next day, the shelter sat in absolute stillness under a sky full of stars. Kowalczyk was half asleep, curled in his sleeping bag, when a faint scraping sound reached his ears, barely audible over the hum of the heater. He ignored it at first, assuming it was snow shifting in the wind, or perhaps frost crystals brushing the fabric walls. The sound grew sharper, more intentional. Then the side flap of the shelter abruptly tore open. Cold air rushed in, along with the unmistakable form of a black bear. It was emaciated and restless, likely drawn by the fish scent and desperate enough to approach even in the biting cold. In the tight space of the shelter, barely 2 meters across, Kowalczyk and the bear found themselves inches apart. The bear hesitated. Its breath curled in white plumes, and its eyes reflected the glow of Kowalczyk's headlamp. Time seemed to stall. Then it moved forward, inch by inch, shoulders squeezing through the gap in the flap. Kowalczyk's hand scrambled through his supply box until he found the emergency marine flare. His fingers, stiff with cold, struggled to strike it. When it finally ignited, the flare bathed the shelter in a harsh red glow, filling it with acrid smoke and a searing light that reflected off the bear's dark coat. The confined space magnified the chaos, the smoke, the light, and the sudden noise. The bear swiped. One paw raked across Kowalczyk's left thigh, slashing through his pants and cutting deep. Pain burst through him like a lightning strike. Fueled by panic and instinct, he kicked with his right foot and waved the burning flare toward the animal's face. The bear flinched and backed out, retreating into the early morning darkness beyond the flap. Knowing this was his only chance, Kowalczyk bolted from the shelter, barefoot and wrapped in a torn sleeping bag. The cold hit him like a hammer. He could feel the numbness setting in almost immediately, but he sprinted across the slick ice toward his snowmobile about 30 meters away. Behind him, the bear returned to the shelter, rummaging through what was left in search of food. Kowalczyk reached the machine, half delirious from pain and cold, and managed to start the engine after 3 attempts. He tore across the frozen lake, heading toward the only place he knew might have help, a small private resort nestled on the western shore. He arrived, shaking and near collapse. The resort owner, a woman in her 60s who lived on site year-round, opened her door to find him bleeding, barefoot, and barely coherent. Her quick thinking, administering basic first aid and calling for emergency services, likely saved his life. He was transported to a regional clinic where he spent 3 days recovering from hypothermia, deep lacerations, and frostbite on both feet. Wildlife officials later located the bear still near the destroyed shelter. It was tranquilized and examined, revealing a fishing lure embedded in its lower jaw, infected and swollen. The injury had likely prevented the animal from eating properly for weeks. After medical treatment, it was relocated to a more suitable habitat farther north. Kowalczyk's physical recovery was swift compared to the mental toll. The memory of waking to see a bear pressing into his shelter lingered, vivid and invasive. He described it later to local reporters not with bravado but with quiet awe, an encounter with something primordial, something ancient and indifferent. He eventually returned to ice fishing the following year, but never again alone. He now carried more than just gear, satellite communications, additional flares, and a new awareness of how quickly routine could collapse into survival. The incident prompted local authorities to revise safety recommendations for winter anglers, particularly in remote areas. New signage, pamphlets, and training emphasized secure waste disposal and the possibility, however remote, of encountering wildlife year-round. For Kowalczyk, the trip that had once been a retreat from life's noise became something else entirely, a testament to resilience and a sobering reminder of the wilderness's capacity for both beauty and danger. The afternoon sky hung low and heavy, with a thick blanket of gray clouds, as the rescue team gathered near the helipad, deep within the remote logging camp. The ground beneath their feet was hard and frozen, patches of snow stubbornly holding onto the edges of the clearing where the helicopter's rotor blades stirred up a swirling cloud of snow and dust. The scent of pine and earth, mixed with the sharp metallic smell of blood, drifted from the stretcher where the injured logger lay. Sergei, a seasoned woodsman in his late 30s, was strapped down tightly, his face pale and his breathing shallow after a brutal fall through the ice earlier that morning. His leg was broken, bleeding steadily, and the team worked quickly to prepare him for an airlift to the nearest hospital. The helicopter's blades chopped through the frigid air, their steady drone filling the clearing, but the tension among the medics was palpable. They knew the forest surrounding them was home to grizzly bears, and the scent of blood was a dangerous magnet. As the pilot adjusted his controls, his gaze darted nervously toward the tree line, where dark shadows flickered among the towering pines. Suddenly, Without warning, a massive grizzly burst from the tree line less than 10 feet away, its heavy paws thudding against the frozen earth as it charged into the open. Panic rippled through the small rescue crew. The bear's eyes were wild and rage-filled, black fur matted and dripping with patches of wet snow. One of the medics, Anna, a young woman with years of wilderness training and a calm determination, stepped forward instinctively, moving between the bear and the stretcher in a desperate attempt to shield her team and the injured logger. The bear struck with terrifying speed, slamming Anna to the ground. Her body hit the hard earth with a sickening thud, the air forced from her lungs. She cried out silently as pain shot through her back where she landed, but her instinct to protect did not waver. Another medic, Pavel, rushed to help, grabbing the rescue axe from the stretcher. He swung it toward the bear, aiming for its massive snout, hoping to force it back, but the grizzly was faster. It struck Pavel with a powerful swipe of its paw, knocking him down hard. Pavel gasped for air, pain radiating through his ribs as the breath was momentarily crushed from his lungs. His vision blurred, but he fought to remain conscious, watching the bear's snarling face loom over him. The pilot, Igor, sat tensely in the cockpit, his heart pounding as he gripped the controls. The sudden chaos jolted him into action, and with a roar of the engine, he lifted the helicopter a few feet off the ground. The weight of the chopper shifted, forcing the bear to back away slightly, growling and snapping its jaws in frustration. The rotor wash stirred the snow and dust into a fierce cloud that obscured the bear's view for a moment. Two other medics, Natasha and Dmitri, dove quickly beneath the helicopter, pressing themselves flat against the frozen ground, caught between the heavy machinery above and the snarling predator inches away. For nearly half an hour, the bear paced back and forth just beyond the circle of rotor wash, clearly agitated by the scent of blood and the chaotic scene unfolding in its territory. Its heavy breaths steamed in the cold air as it growled low and deep, ears pinned back, eyes flicking with suspicion and fury. The rescue team remained frozen, each second stretched by adrenaline and fear, hoping the bear would tire or lose interest. The injured logger lay still, forgotten amid the chaos, his broken body vulnerable but safe within the cage of the stretcher and the frantic energy surrounding him. Finally, distant voices broke through the tension. Wildlife rangers arrived on foot, their faces grim and alert. They carried tranquilizer guns loaded with powerful sedatives designed to bring down even the largest grizzlies without killing them. Carefully, the rangers positioned themselves at the edge of the clearing, their eyes locked on the pacing bear. The grizzly turned its head sharply, sensing the new threat, and with a final frustrated roar, it charged back toward the forest line, disappearing among the trees with a spray of snow and broken branches. In the aftermath, the team counted their losses. The initial blow shattered Anna's back, and despite desperate efforts to stabilize her, she succumbed to her injuries before rescue helicopters could arrive. Pavel was severely injured, ribs broken, and his breath shallow, his survival uncertain. The rest of the medics were shaken, bruised, and exhausted but alive. Sergei, the injured logger, remained where he had fallen, still strapped to the stretcher, but safe from further harm in the confusion. The rescue mission had turned into a nightmare, a brutal reminder that the forest was not a place they controlled. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the blood-stained snow, the helicopter finally lifted Sergei away, the medics carrying with them the heavy weight of loss and fear. The forest swallowed the fading echoes of chaos, leaving only the silence of the wild, a silence that spoke of power, danger, and the harsh laws of nature. The circus tent stood like a giant striped monument at the edge of the city, pulsing with music and bright lights as hundreds of people crowded inside. Laughter and anticipation filled the air while children tugged at their parents' sleeves, and performers in sequined costumes moved through the crowd, tossing candy and balloons. The ringmaster drew attention beneath the arched beams of the canvas roof, and in the center ring, under a spotlight of golden haze, a massive brown bear stood upright, balancing on its hind legs and turning slowly on a platform to delighted applause. The bear, nearly 7 feet tall and weighing over 600 pounds, was the grand finale of the night, a spectacle that drew families from across the region. Children stared with wide eyes as the towering animal, clad in a loose red collar and guided by 2 handlers with long poles and treats, moved through a routine of rehearsed gestures, standing, bowing, and spinning. Each movement appeared stiff but controlled, the illusion of discipline held together only by training and familiarity. Unseen beneath the surface, however, a quiet unease stirred within the animal. In the front row, a boy named Lucas, 8 years old with a round face and tousled brown hair, sat beside his mother and younger sister. Clutching a box of popcorn, he leaned forward, entranced by the towering bear. Its thick fur gleamed under the lights, and clouds of breath escaped its mouth despite the warmth inside the tent. The handlers barked commands and waved treats to maintain the act, yet something seemed off. A stiffness in the bear's frame, a twitch in its eye, subtle signs of growing distress unnoticed by most. Without warning, everything changed. The bear halted mid-step, abruptly turned toward the edge of the ring, and with a deep, guttural sound that sliced through music and chatter, it lunged forward. Whether the leash snapped or slipped from the handler's grasp was unclear, but the creature broke through the low barrier with terrifying speed and force, closing the gap between performer and audience in seconds. Panic erupted. Screams rang out as spectators bolted from their seats, toppling chairs and spilling food. The bear had already locked eyes on Lucas, who sat frozen in fear as the enormous creature reared up before him. With one swipe of its paw, it sent the popcorn flying. A moment later, its jaws clamped around the boy's small arm. Lucas was yanked partly from his seat in a single jolt, pain surging through him as his mother tried to reach him. She was pushed back by the stampede of the fleeing crowd. The bear shook the boy with violent force, its teeth sinking deep. Blood soaked Lucas's shirt as chaos spread. The handlers raced into action, shouting, tossing meat, and trying to draw the animal's attention. Lucas remained in the bear's grip, his body jerking with each movement as panic overtook the tent. His cries were swallowed by the noise and confusion. A metal pole jabbed into the bear's side, not hard enough to harm, but enough to startle it. The animal growled, blood on its mouth, and hesitated. Yet instead of releasing the child, it clamped down harder. More handlers rushed in, forming a wide arc, shouting, clanging tools, and creating as much commotion as possible to distract the animal. After moments that felt like an eternity, the bear dropped Lucas. The boy collapsed, limp and bloodied. As the bear turned to swipe at a nearby trainer, 2 men rushed in and pulled Lucas out of reach. The team surrounded the animal, forcing it back toward the ring. Reinforced gates slammed shut behind it, locking the creature away once more. Lucas was carried to the exit, pale and barely conscious, his arm badly injured. Medics arrived swiftly and placed him in an ambulance as onlookers gathered outside. Sirens echoed into the night while news of the incident spread quickly. The circus grounds dissolved into flashing lights, sobbing parents, and urgent questions. At the hospital, surgeons worked into the early morning. They managed to save the arm, though the damage was extensive. Doctors warned of a long recovery, both physical and emotional. Though Lucas survived, the experience, the image of the bear, the sounds of terror, the helplessness, left deep marks on everyone present that night. The aftermath brought swift consequences. The circus faced immediate scrutiny. Safety measures, licensing, and the use of wild animals in performance came under harsh review from local authorities and animal welfare groups. Within days, multiple shows were canceled, and an investigation was launched. The public response was intense, and discussions around legislation banning the use of wild animals in entertainment gained traction. In time, Lucas began to recover, though the journey ahead remained difficult. The memory of that night, the noise, the power of the animal, and the confusion would remain with him and those around him for years. The spectacle that had once drawn awe and excitement now stood as a symbol of the unpredictable dangers lurking beneath the surface of human-controlled displays. For many, it marked the beginning of a long overdue conversation about the ethics of wild animals in captivity and the responsibilities owed to both the creatures and the people placed so close to them. The bitter cold of a Pacific Northwest winter had settled deep into the forest, coating the trees and ground with heavy snow that muffled footsteps and muted the usual sounds of wildlife. In a remote ranger station, nestled between towering pines and rugged hills, the quiet was broken only by the creak of wood settling and the occasional whistle of wind, through the gaps in the old building's weathered walls. The station, a modest structure meant to serve as a temporary shelter and base for rangers patrolling the area, stood vulnerable against the harsh season, its sturdy doors and windows offering the only protection from the relentless cold and wild creatures lurking just beyond the tree line. Inside, the kitchen held the promise of warmth and sustenance, stocked with canned goods, dried food, and small supplies brought in from the nearest town. Food was carefully rationed in this isolated outpost, but the harsh winter had made even the smallest stores a beacon for desperate animals driven by hunger. A black bear, large and powerful, had been roaming the forest edges for days, drawn ever closer by the scent of the rations stored in the station. It was a mature male, its thick fur matted and dull from cold and hunger, its eyes sharp with growing desperation. Hunger had pushed it beyond normal caution, eroding the natural fear of humans that once kept such creatures at a distance. One bitter night, when the wind outside was lashing snow against the windows, the bear found the back door of the ranger station left slightly ajar, a rare but critical mistake made during a hurried exit earlier in the day. Without hesitation, the bear forced its massive body through the narrow opening, the wooden frame splintering under its weight and claws. Inside, the bear's powerful paws tore through the kitchen, scattering cans and boxes in a chaotic mess as it sought food with frantic energy. The air filled with the harsh smell of crushed metal and spilled food, the sound of destruction echoing in the cramped space. The animal's desperation was clear. It gnawed at cans, pawed frantically through shelves, and overturned containers in search of nourishment. Every movement sent sharp splinters of wood and metal crashing to the floor, and the heavy scent of animal musk mixed with the stale air inside. For a long moment, the bear's attention was consumed by the feast it had found, unaware that its intrusion was about to be interrupted. A ranger, returning unexpectedly from a late patrol, approached the station through the snow, his boots crunching loudly despite the drifting flakes. The sudden noise startled the bear, which turned quickly, revealing its full size and ferocity to the man who stood frozen near the threshold. The ranger, a seasoned man in his 40s, strong, experienced, and accustomed to the wilderness, felt a surge of adrenaline at the shock of the encounter. Cornered and frantic, the bear reacted with aggressive speed. It lunged, jaws snapping, and clamped down hard on the ranger's forearm, crushing flesh and bone with terrifying force. The man was knocked to the ground with a heavy thud, the snow beneath him rapidly stained dark with blood. Pain exploded through his arm, but he fought back with everything he had. Years of training and field work kicked in, driving him to resist the panic threatening to consume him. Scrambling to reach the nearest object, a heavy metal lamp from a nearby table, he swung it with brutal force at the bear's snarling face. The lamp shattered against thick fur and bone, causing the animal to recoil for a split second. The ranger, summoning every ounce of strength, responded with a commanding roar, hoping to startle the animal with noise and movement. The bear's eyes burned with fury as it swiped again with massive claws, raking across the man's chest and sending shards of wood and blood into the air. The attack was violent and overwhelming. But within moments, the chaos shifted. Another ranger, the man's partner, arrived after hearing the commotion from outside. Younger but calm and capable, he sprang into action with practiced precision. From just inside the doorway, he deployed a thick cloud of bear spray, aiming directly at the animal's face. The burning chemical hit its mark, forcing the bear to stagger backward, snarling and blinking furiously. Acting swiftly, the partner fired several warning shots into the air. The sharp, echoing blasts split the night and amplified the confusion. Disoriented, the bear lashed out one final time, its claws grazing the wounded ranger's side before retreating. With heavy footsteps, it vanished into the snow-covered trees, leaving behind a trail of blood, wreckage, and lingering fear. The two rangers moved quickly to assess the damage. The injuries were severe but not fatal. The bite wound to the forearm was deep and would require urgent medical attention. Still, the man's resilience, combined with fast action and teamwork, had likely saved his life. News of the encounter spread quickly throughout the local forestry service and surrounding communities. The event served as a sobering reminder of the rising boldness among wildlife, especially black bears, as food scarcity and harsh winters drove them further into human-occupied territory. In the aftermath, safety protocols across ranger stations in the region were reviewed and tightened. Extra precautions were mandated, including the reinforcement of door and window locks, additional training on emergency animal deterrence, and clear directives about never leaving any point of entry unsecured. The urgency of preparing for winter-related wildlife encounters was underscored by this near-tragic incident. Patrols were increased at night, and rangers were issued more advanced deterrent tools. Discussions among wildlife experts and conservation organizations intensified, focusing on the complex relationship between environmental pressures and animal behavior. The shrinking availability of natural food sources, driven by habitat loss and climate-related shifts, had led to more unpredictable and dangerous patterns in wildlife movement and aggression. These were not merely isolated incidents, but part of a broader trend demanding coordinated responses from multiple stakeholders. Balancing the need to protect vulnerable animal populations with the necessity of ensuring human safety became a more pressing issue. Solutions required public education, changes in wilderness management, and strategies for coexisting with wildlife without compromising the integrity of natural spaces or endangering lives. As for the wounded ranger, the experience left lasting marks. The physical recovery was slow and painful, complicated by torn muscle and shattered bone, but the deeper wounds were emotional. The memory of the bear's raw power, the surprise of the attack, and the razor-thin margin between life and death. Even so, he remained steadfast in his purpose. Though shaken, his dedication to the forest, to his work, and to the animals themselves endured. His survival became a quiet symbol among his peers, of strength, clarity under pressure, and the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. For those who spend their lives in these remote places, the event stood as a visceral example of what it truly means to coexist with the wild. Not in dominance, not in conquest, but with vigilance, respect, and a hard-earned understanding that nature, in all its beauty and brutality, follows no script. Arctic fjords of a high northern region were cloaked in deep, biting cold as a group of friends moved steadily across a frozen shoreline, their snowboards cutting through pristine snow beneath a pale gray sky. Wind whispered through jagged cliffs, carrying the faint scent of sea ice and salt that clung to the icy terrain. Among them, a man in his late 20s named Eric stood slightly apart, lean and observant, taking in the breathtaking but unforgiving beauty of the remote wilderness. The group had sought a day of adventure, drawn by the solitude and challenge of snowboarding in one of the world's most isolated environments. Their movements were fluid, their laughter quiet but genuine, filled with shared excitement and the silent trust built among people facing the elements together. What none of them noticed was the large figure silently moving through the distant tree line, concealed almost entirely by the snow and mist. A polar bear, driven by hunger and desperation due to dwindling access to its natural prey, had ventured closer to the shoreline than usual. Its thick white fur rendered it nearly invisible against the frozen backdrop, and its heavy paws moved with a silence that defied its massive size. As Eric adjusted his stance and prepared for the next descent, his focus was elsewhere, unaware of the danger closing in. Suddenly, the bear charged. The quiet of the Arctic morning was shattered by the thunderous force of its sprint. Eric had only a fraction of a second to register the movement before the animal collided with him, knocking him violently to the frozen ground. The sheer impact stunned him, the cold surface beneath his body cracking and shifting beneath the weight of the collision. The others turned at the sound, their moment of joy ripped apart by the chaos now unfolding only yards away. The predator attacked with unrelenting force, its jaws closing on Eric with primal precision. The weight of the animal pressed the air from his lungs as it struck again and again. The cold wind faded into the background as pain and shock overtook him, and the snow beneath turned dark with blood. Eric struggled, driven by instinct, but the bear's strength was overwhelming. Its claws and teeth tore into him with terrifying efficiency, leaving him broken and battered in moments. The others, frozen by fear but driven by the will to act, scrambled into motion. Some fired emergency flares into the air, hoping the noise and sudden bursts of light would disrupt the attack. Others shouted and struck rocks together, using sound and movement to create confusion. For a brief moment, the bear hesitated, its eyes flicking toward the chaos erupting nearby. But hunger and instinct prevailed. The attack resumed with a final surge before the animal turned and began to retreat. Slowly, the bear moved back into the tree line, its massive form fading into the snow and fog until it was once again part of the Arctic stillness. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Eric lay motionless on the ground, the snow around him disturbed and stained by the violence of the encounter. His friends gathered quickly, their faces pale with shock, doing what they could to keep him warm and responsive while sending out emergency signals. Rescue crews arrived swiftly, guided by the flares and distress calls. Eric was transported by emergency team to the nearest medical station, but the damage had been too severe. Despite their best efforts, his injuries proved fatal. His life ended quietly in the cold, a tragic reminder of the risks hidden within the stark beauty of the far north. The incident sent waves of shock through nearby communities, where life was always shaped by the rhythms and risks of the wilderness. Though devastating, the attack was not an isolated occurrence. In recent years, polar bears had increasingly come into contact with humans, their habitats shrinking and traditional food sources vanishing due to rapid environmental changes. Wildlife specialists responded with urgency, emphasizing that encounters like this were becoming more frequent and more dangerous. Authorities issued immediate warnings, encouraging travelers and explorers to take greater precautions when entering polar bear territory. New safety guidelines were implemented. Travel in groups, carry deterrent devices, maintain constant vigilance, and avoid known wildlife corridors. Local leaders also called for improved infrastructure to support both human safety and wildlife conservation, advocating for long-term solutions that could help reduce these tragic confrontations. The public response was one of grief, reflection, and reevaluation. Adventurers reconsidered the allure of the untamed, weighing the risks more seriously. Eric was remembered with love and respect, a young man drawn to the wild not out of recklessness, but out of admiration for its grandeur and challenge. His death became a solemn emblem of the fragile line between awe and danger, between human ambition and natural force. For those who had witnessed the event firsthand, the experience left a lasting mark. The sound of the bear's movements, the sight of Eric beneath it, the chaotic scramble to intervene, all lingered long after the snow was undisturbed again. In the weeks that followed, memorials were held and stories were shared. Eric's legacy became more than the story of a tragic accident. It became a catalyst for awareness. His death highlighted the urgent need for coexistence strategies that respect both human life and the needs of vulnerable wildlife. As climate change continues to shift the balance of remote ecosystems, such encounters may grow more common. Yet with awareness, education, and planning, the goal remains to prevent such tragedies, honoring both the people who venture into the wild and the animals struggling to survive within it. The morning on Kodiak Island began with a cold, biting wind that swept down from rugged mountains, carrying the salty scent of the sea and the faint rustle of waves against the rocky shore. Alex, a seasoned fisherman in his mid-50s, with weathered hands and a lifetime of experience reading the tides, was carefully reeling in his catch near a quiet cove. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as he worked methodically, the smooth pull of the fishing line under his fingers a familiar and comforting rhythm. Nearby, a small pile of freshly caught salmon gleamed wet and silver on the jagged rocks, ready to be cleaned and packed for the journey home. Alex remained focused, fully aware of the dangers posed by the wild terrain, but confident in his skills and deep knowledge of the land he had fished for decades. Without warning, from the edge of the tree line beyond the rocks, a massive brown bear emerged almost silently, its large form blending into the shadows of the dense forest. The bear's dark eyes locked onto the salmon with sharp intent, its muscles rippling beneath a thick coat of fur as it moved forward with surprising speed. Alex's heart raced as he spotted the creature's approach. Before he could fully react, the bear lunged, snatching several of the gleaming fish with brutal efficiency. Its powerful jaws clamped down on the slippery bodies and dragged them away from the rocky shore. The sound of the sudden movement shattered the morning calm, and Alex reacted with a mixture of shock and alarm. Instinct took over as he raised his rifle, the cold metal steady in his grip despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through him. But the bear was not finished. Enraged by the disturbance and the attempted defense of its stolen meal, it charged with terrifying speed, crashing through branches and skidding over loose stones as it closed the distance. Alex barely had time to brace himself before the bear's massive paws struck, knocking him off balance and sending him sprawling onto the uneven ground. Its claws slashed across his thigh with ferocious force, tearing deep into muscle and flesh and sending shockwaves of pain through his body. Blood welled quickly from the wound, soaking through the fabric of his pants and pooling on the rocky earth beneath him. Staggering back, Alex scrambled to his feet, gritting his teeth against the pain as he fired several warning shots into the air. The loud cracks of gunfire echoed sharply in the still morning, startling the bear momentarily and causing it to hesitate. Yet rather than retreating, the animal began to circle him with a deliberate, calculated patience. Its dark eyes remained locked on him, as if weighing the next move with intelligence and intent. The bear lunged again, once more crashing forward with incredible speed. It grazed Alex's outstretched arm, shredding the skin and sending him reeling sideways. Fighting to keep his balance, he battled against the pain and disorientation, his heart pounding wildly in his chest as he struggled to remain upright amid the chaos. With a final, powerful burst of motion, the bear turned and retreated toward the forest, carrying its stolen catch in its jaws as it vanished into the dense trees. Alex collapsed onto the rocks, trembling from the pain and adrenaline, his blood mixing with the cold sea spray while the wind howled around him. The wounds on his thigh and arm burned with intensity, and the weight of the encounter settled heavily over him. Though shaken and injured, he understood the urgency of acting quickly. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself upright and began a slow, painful trek back toward the small fishing village, located several miles inland. Every step was agonizing, but the thought of help and safety drove him forward along the rugged coastline. As he limped along, the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs served as a reminder of the wilderness's relentless presence. His mind raced with memories of the attack. The bear's explosive charge, the slicing claws, the overwhelming scent of fur and earth mingled with blood. Deep down, Alex recognized that the bear's boldness was more than a random act. Environmental shifts were changing behavior. Scarcity of food in the unforgiving terrain was pushing these apex predators to take greater risks, drawing them dangerously close to human activity. By the time Alex reached the village, the close-knit community had sprung into action, rushing him to the nearest medical clinic. There, doctors cleaned and stitched his wounds, working for hours to stabilize his condition. The injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. Recovery would be a long, painful process, but it was possible. The emotional impact, however, ran far deeper than the cuts on his body. Alex knew that what he had experienced was not just a personal ordeal. It was a clear warning sign about the changing nature of coexistence between humans and the wild. In response, local authorities and wildlife specialists issued urgent alerts to fishermen and outdoor workers in the region. They stressed the need for vigilance and preparedness, urging people to keep food securely stored and to avoid behaviors that could attract bears to populated areas. The message was stark and immediate. As these animals adapted to shrinking food resources and expanding human activity, close encounters were no longer isolated incidents. They were becoming part of a troubling new pattern. Experts recommended deterrents such as bear spray and emphasized the importance of staying calm, backing away slowly, and avoiding eye contact in the presence of bears. They also advised against making sudden movements, noting that aggression often followed perceived threats. Education and preparation were now essential tools in avoiding tragedy. Despite these efforts, the community remained on edge, the attack a sobering reminder of how narrow the line was between survival and disaster in remote environments. The story quickly spread beyond the island, drawing attention to the broader challenges of wildlife management, habitat overlap, and human safety. For Alex, the memory of the bear's charge and the deep, burning pain of his injuries would never fully fade. Yet, through the trauma, he found the same quiet determination that had always guided him. There was no question that he would heal, and no doubt that he would return to the life he had built in the wild, more cautious, more aware, but still deeply connected to the land he had always called home. Landon Reese was 53, wiry and sun-worn, with over 2 decades of wilderness experience behind him. He'd spent most of his adult life guiding rafting tours, mapping unnamed creeks, and camping solo in the remote folds of British Columbia. That week, he'd been following an unmarked tributary of the Stickeen River, kayaking deep into Grizzly country. It wasn't recklessness that brought him out here. It was comfort. Solitude was his element, the river his refuge. On the 3rd evening of his trip, Landon set camp on a gravel bank near a tight bend in the river. He stashed his food in a bear canister and put it far from camp, just like he always did. His bright orange kayak was pulled onto the shore and propped on a driftwood log. As the sun dropped behind the evergreens, he boiled water for dehydrated stew and checked over his gear. Everything seemed calm. He didn't see the bear until it moved toward his boat. The grizzly stepped silently from the trees. A big male, tall at the shoulder and heavy-set, its coat dusted with river silt and pine needles. It didn't growl or stomp. It stared at the kayak with a focused hunger, then walked straight toward it. Landon stood quickly, heart racing, and began shouting. Sharp, confident, deliberate noise. Most bears would turn at that. This one didn't. Instead, it walked up to the kayak and began sniffing the seams. Landon watched in disbelief as the bear opened its jaws and bit straight through the outer shell of the vessel. The plastic gave way with a sharp crack. Then the grizzly clawed at the front hatch, tearing deeper, ripping through gear still holding traces of old food smells, long-forgotten trail mix maybe, or grease that had settled into the padding. The scent was enough. Landon grabbed his bear spray from the side pouch of his tent and began moving forward. He knew the risk, but he couldn't afford to lose the kayak. It was his only way out. He held the canister at the ready, stepped closer, and prepared to spray the bear directly in the face. But the bear turned before he fired. It moved faster than his reflexes. Instantly, it lunged from the smashed kayak and closed the distance. Its paw slammed into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him sprawling back toward the river. He hit the water's edge hard, shoulder twisting at an unnatural angle as he rolled. The bear followed, growling low, and bit down on his upper shoulder, its teeth driving through his jacket and deep into flesh. Landon screamed. His body thrashed. In a blind panic, he gripped the bear spray and triggered it underwater. The spray fanned out uselessly beneath the surface, absorbed into the current, but some of the mist curled into the air just enough to sting the bear's face. It reared back, coughing and shaking its head, foam and river water mixing in the spray. That hesitation saved him. Landon crawled up from the river, one arm limp at his side, soaked and shivering, blood streaming down his back. The bear lingered, pacing, then snorted and disappeared into the trees, leaving the wrecked kayak in pieces on the gravel. The pain in his arm told him it was dislocated. His shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, muscles seizing. He sat there for minutes, dazed, dripping, his breath ragged in the twilight air. The nearest ranger station was more than 20 kilometers downstream. Without a kayak, he had nothing but the river. He knew he wouldn't survive the night if he stayed. Shaking, he gathered what remained of his gear. Dry bags floated at the edge of the shore. One had duct tape and a small patch kit inside. He worked with one functioning arm and his teeth, strapping the dry bags together and taping them to a broken section of the kayak frame. The float barely held shape, but it would carry him. He stuffed the rest of his supplies inside, wrapped himself in the remains of his bivy sack, and pushed off from the shore. The river was cold, the current strong. He drifted mostly, using his legs and one good hand to steer around boulders and deadfall. The stars came out above him, harsh and indifferent. Pain coursed through every part of his body. His shoulder burned with every shiver. Blood still leaked from the puncture wounds on his back. At some point before dawn, he started to hallucinate, thinking he saw lights in the trees or people on the bank. He knew none of it was real. Morning came slowly, the sky brightening over the pines. The river narrowed in places, pushing him faster. He held on. Hours passed. His body was numb, and he began to drift in and out of consciousness. When the ranger station finally appeared, a simple wood cabin with a flagpole and a battered canoe, he almost didn't believe it. He dragged himself onto the shore, stumbling up the rocky slope. The ranger inside heard the thud of a body hitting the porch and opened the door to find Landon half collapsed, his face pale, jacket soaked in blood. He was rushed by helicopter to the nearest hospital later that day. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. The bear bite had narrowly missed major arteries. His shoulder was dislocated and fractured. He had early-stage hypothermia and dozens of cuts and bruises, but he lived. Landon didn't return to the river that season. His kayak was later recovered, its body riddled with punctures and claw marks. The bear was never found. Authorities inspected the site and noted that the food had been stored properly, but they concluded the bear was likely conditioned to human scent and food residue on gear. A single smear of peanut oil left months earlier might have triggered the attack. Word spread among the backcountry community. People who had once viewed Landon as invincible were shaken. He'd done everything right, secured food, kept distance, carried spray, but it hadn't been enough. The river took his blood that night, but it also carried him out. As his wounds healed, the memory of the bear's silent way of studying his kayak like prey remained burned into his mind. It was a brutal reminder that in the wild, even experience didn't guarantee safety, and sometimes the quietest moments hid the deadliest threats. Nielsen had spent years chasing patterns in the polar cold, ice thickness, wind drift, seasonal melt, all part of his work with the Danish Arctic Research Program. At 44, he was seasoned, cautious, and deeply respectful of the landscape. His team had set up camp on a remote ice shelf in northern Greenland, far from any settlement. They were there for 2 weeks, collecting climate data from automated weather instruments and drilling core samples from the permafrost below. That night, the wind had finally died down after days of relentless howling. Snow drifted lightly over the ice, and the long twilight of the Arctic dawn still lighted the sky. Lars had gone to bed inside a small nylon tent just 50 meters from the central weather pod, zipped into a thermal-rated sleeping bag with his parka tucked beneath his head. Outside, the temperature hovered around -20 Celsius, and the stillness was absolute. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the ears. The bear came from the north. It had likely smelled the camp from kilometers away, its nose catching a trace of food oil or human scent. Polar bears hunted with terrifying patience, and this one moved with ghost-like precision, crossing the frozen plain in silence. There were no fences, no barriers, just gear stowed in crates and nylon shelters pinned to the ice. The researchers hadn't seen tracks in days, but the bear had come anyway, padding softly through the wind-smoothed snow. Lars didn't wake when the bear first touched the tent. The weight came suddenly, a pressure explosion as the wall collapsed inwards. Claws ripped through the fabric, and the floor shifted beneath him. Then the sleeping bag moved. He was being dragged. At first, he thought it was a storm. Then he heard the crunching of paws and the low, rumbling breath. The bear had the sleeping bag in its jaws, shaking it as it pulled him across the ice. His body twisted inside the fabric, bouncing off frozen ridges. The cold tore through as the zipper burst open. Then he felt the pain. Teeth crushed into his upper arm, grinding bone. Another bite clamped onto his shoulder, tearing muscle. He screamed, but the sound vanished into the empty white around him. His mind spun in panic. The weight, the jaws, the ice beneath. It was happening so fast, yet each second burned with detail. In the nearby pod, a colleague, Dr. Sophie Roning, was finishing a weather reading when she heard the tent collapse. She glanced through the window and saw movement. Then she heard the scream. Without hesitation, she grabbed the emergency flare gun and rushed into the cold, boots crunching over the ice. The flare hissed upward in a brilliant arc, red fire lighting the air above the camp. The bear flinched. It dropped Lars and turned toward the light, confused and squinting. Lars, bleeding and limp, lay beside his shredded bag, barely conscious. Sophie ran to him, yelling and waving. The bear lingered just meters away, massive and pale, its breath steaming as it paced in irritation. She fired another flare. The bear turned, lumbered a few steps, and vanished into the fog like a ghost dissolving in smoke. Sophie dropped to her knees beside Lars. Blood soaked through the ice around his arm and shoulder, and his face was gray with shock. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. She wrapped his wounds with thermal wraps and radioed for medevac. Though she knew the truth, no chopper would reach them quickly. A storm was building offshore. They'd be lucky to see help before nightfall. She kept him stable for hours, monitoring his pulse and swapping heat packs while scanning the horizon. The other researchers huddled inside the pod with rifles ready. Nobody slept. When the storm eased 8 hours later, a Station Nord helicopter finally arrived. The evacuation was brutal. Wind tossed the aircraft, and medics had to load Lars with care to avoid aggravating the injuries. He was rushed to a trauma center, where doctors performed emergency surgery to save his arm. They managed to stop the bleeding and repair some of the torn muscle, but the nerve damage was permanent. Lars lost partial use of his left arm and would carry a slight limp from frostbite in his hip, where the bear had dragged him bare-skinned over the ice. The polar research community reeled. Photos of the shredded tent and blood-stained drag marks circulated among field teams. Safety protocols were rewritten overnight. Every Arctic station now enforced armed patrols, elevated sleeping pods, round-the-clock watch shifts, and new emergency beacon standards. For Lars, the healing was slow. The physical pain came in bursts, numb fingers, scar tissue tightening across the shoulder. But the worst damage was quiet. Sleep became hard. He would jolt awake, heart racing, feeling the crushing jaws again. Sometimes, the silence of his apartment brought back the same sensation he'd felt before the attack. That absolute stillness, just seconds before death arrived. He gave interviews months later. People expected anger, bitterness, maybe resentment toward the animal that had nearly killed him. But Lars only spoke of the moment before it all. The way the silence had held everything in place. How the bear hadn't growled, hadn't snarled, had just come like a force of nature. He didn't see it as malice, only hunger, instinct, and a clash between two lives that never should have touched. He said what haunted him most wasn't the pain, or the blood, or even the fear. It was how close death had come without a sound, and how easily, in the frozen heart of the Arctic, it could happen again. The cold was sharp, but familiar, as Noah moved slowly through the chest-deep water of the river that wound its way near Fraser Lake, its flow clear and steady, the evening light fading into soft shades of gray and blue. He had fished this same stretch of river every summer for years, drawn by the run of salmon that turned the water restless and alive during late July. The sound of the current filled his ears, and the feel of his fly rod in his gloved hand kept his focus tight, casting and retrieving in rhythm, scanning for the flicker of movement beneath the surface. The air smelled like pine and damp moss, and the fading sun cast long shadows from the shoreline trees that stood tall and silent on either side of the river. He was alone, but that had never bothered him. Solitude was part of the ritual and peace. Now and then, he glanced toward the bank where he'd left his pack to remind himself of his way out. The thought of bears always lingered out here, but after years without so much as a distant sighting, the worry had dulled into something closer to habit than fear. He didn't see the Kodiak bear until it was already in the river with him, massive, silent, and terrifying in its sudden presence. It moved through the water without a sound, drawn by the salmon, its huge paws cutting through the current like oars, its head low and eyes fixed. By the time Noah turned, the bear was just yards away, a living wall of fur and muscle that crashed into him like a battering ram. There was no growl, no warning, just impact, raw and heavy, sending him sprawling backward into the cold, choking current. His head fell instantly, the world above vanishing in a swirl of bubbles and shadows. His fly rod disappeared from his hand as his back slammed against the riverbed, rocks bruising his spine as he struggled to right himself. When he surfaced, sputtering, the bear was straddling him in the shallows, water surging around its legs, its weight pressing against his hip as it sniffed and huffed at his chest. The animal hadn't targeted him yet, but in that moment, it was clear it had mistaken him for a rival, something in the water that didn't belong. Then came the pain. A sudden, sharp pressure tore into his left side as the bear bit him, not deep, but deep enough. The teeth closed on his flesh, through his jacket, through the skin, sending a bolt of pain through his ribs that nearly made him scream. But he didn't. He froze, his instincts drowning out the agony, his arms curling up over the back of his neck as he let his body go limp. Playing dead wasn't a tactic he'd practiced, but it was the only thing that made sense. No movement, no fight, just silence. and breath held low. The bear let go, exhaling with a thick grunt, its warm breath steaming against Noah's soaked face. It swatted at his leg, tearing one of the straps on his waders loose, tugging at the material as though testing him. Confused but not yet fully aggressive, he didn't move. He barely breathed. Seconds dragged into a long, suspended moment as the bear's snout hovered near his chest, then turned slightly as it caught movement just beside him. A large salmon, thrashing in panic, its body shimmering in the dusk. In one fluid motion, the bear lunged sideways, pounced on the fish, and pulled it up with a wet, flopping slap, water flying from its jaws. Then, just as suddenly, it turned and moved back toward the bank, the fish clenched tightly in its teeth, its huge frame slipping silently away into the shadows beyond the trees. The water calmed in its wake, leaving only the sound of the current and the shaking breath that finally tore free from Noah's lungs. He stayed where he was, flat in the river, the cold sinking deeper into his bones with every passing second. The pain in his side throbbed with each heartbeat, sharp and raw, but not unbearable. The cold was worse. He waited 20 minutes before he dared to move, convinced the bear might still be watching from the trees. When he finally crawled toward the shoreline, each movement was a struggle, his soaked gear weighing him down, his limbs trembling from the cold, fear, and the rush of what had just happened. His hand hit gravel first, then mud, and finally the shore's edge where grass and roots tangled around his arms. He pulled himself onto dry ground and lay there shivering, eyes open to the fading light above the trees, the sound of the river still moving behind him. His side was slick with blood, his jacket torn and clinging to his skin, but he was alive. Not long after, two hikers who had come down from the ridge, drawn by the commotion or simply by chance, found him. They called for help and kept him warm with what they had, wrapping him in dry coats until rescue arrived. He drifted in and out of awareness as they spoke softly nearby, checking his pulse and whispering words of relief he barely understood. Later, when wildlife rangers arrived at the site to investigate, they found torn gear scattered on the shoreline, blood soaked into the gravel near the water's edge, and deep claw marks raked through the stones, as if etched by heavy tools. The bear was gone, the trail cold, the encounter over. His wounds were shallow, not life-threatening, but one bite had come within inches of his spine, close enough that even the surgeon admitted the outcome had been nothing short of miraculous. Noah would carry visible and hidden scars, but he'd survived something primal, something few ever faced and walked away from. The river flowed without pause. The bears returned to their fishing grounds, and he would never again step into that water without feeling the presence of eyes just beyond the trees.